She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her cold. "I would like to know your story," he said softly, and she sat back down. Not because she wanted to. Not because something warm in his tone had reached through the iron casing she had built around herself over years of betrayal and survival and desperate running. She sat back down because her legs simply gave out beneath her, because the weight of everything she had never told a single living soul suddenly became too heavy to carry while also walking away. She gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table in the dim saloon light of Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1883, and she stared at the man across from her as though he had just pulled the pin from a grenade she had spent 3 years pretending did not exist. His eyes were the color of dark river water in October, deep and patient and unbearably steady. He had not moved toward her. He had not reached for her. He had simply spoken 6 words in a voice so quiet they should have been lost beneath the rattle of the piano in the corner, and the scrape of boot heels on the saloon floor. And yet those 6 words had found her as precisely as a bullet finds its mark. Nellie Vaughn pressed her lips together and looked away from Warren Collier's face, because looking at it was doing something dangerous to the careful architecture of her resolve. "You don't want to know my story," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "Nobody who's ever heard it has come out the better for it." "Maybe I'm not interested in coming out the better for it," he said. "Maybe I'm just interested in the truth." And that word, truth, hit her like a slap, because it was the one thing she had been trading away piece by piece for the past 3 years, bartering fragments of honesty for a few more days of safety, a few more miles of distance between herself and the man who wanted her dead. She looked back at Warren Collier then, really looked at him, and she thought about the morning she had arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing but a worn carpet bag, a forged letter of introduction, and a secret so dark it had already swallowed 2 men whole. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that existed in the cracks between more important places. It was not on the main rail line. The telegraph office only worked half the time. The sheriff, a tired old man named Beaumont, was more interested in keeping the peace between the cattle ranchers and the farming settlers than in asking too many questions about the strangers who drifted through. It was exactly the kind of place Nellie had been looking for. She had arrived on the afternoon stage in the first week of March, 1883, and she had stepped down into the mud of the main street with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. She was 26 years old. She had been running for 2 years and 4 months, and she was so tired that tired no longer felt like a temporary condition. It felt like her name. She had presented her forged letter of introduction at the only boarding house in town, run by a stout German woman named Mrs. Heike Brenner, who had looked at the letter, looked at Nellie's face, looked at the carpet bag, and then said in a flat, practical voice that the room would be $1.50 a week and breakfast was at 7, and she would not tolerate any nonsense. Nellie had almost wept from gratitude. She had told Mrs. Brenner and the town and everyone who asked that her name was Eleanor Ward, that she was a widow from St. Louis, that her husband had died of fever, and that she had come west for fresh air and a fresh start. It was a story she had rehearsed so many times it had taken on the smoothed, rounded feeling of a river stone, every rough edge worn away by repetition. For 6 weeks it had worked. She had found part-time work as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations from the women of the town, and she had kept her head down and her mouth shut and her dark past locked behind her eyes where no one could see it. And then Warren Collier had come to town. He had arrived on a Tuesday, riding a tall bay horse with 3 days of trail dust on his coat and a marshal's badge inside his vest that he did not advertise. Nellie had seen him from the window of Mrs. Brenner's parlor, where she was hemming a skirt for the schoolteacher. She had noticed him the way you notice a change in the weather before the clouds form, something in the careful, unhurried way he moved through the street, something in the way his eyes swept the town with the practiced efficiency of a man trained to see everything at once. She had felt the cold finger of dread trace its way down her spine, and she had told herself she was being foolish. Men with that look came through every week. Not every one of them was looking for her, but this one was. She just did not know it yet. She learned his name 2 days later from Mrs. Brenner, who had taken him on as a boarder because she had a vacant room and the money was money. Warren Collier, the old woman said, was a deputy federal marshal out of Santa Fe, passing through on some business he had not described in any detail. Nellie had gone very still at the kitchen table when she heard that, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and she had spent the rest of that evening sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, going through her options with the cold, systematic precision that had kept her alive so far. She could run. She had done it before. She had gotten very good at it. She could be on the morning stage before breakfast, with a new name forming on her tongue before the wheels had cleared the town limits. But she was so tired of running. And Redemption Creek had started to feel, in 6 short weeks, like something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. It had started to feel like a possibility. So she stayed, and she was careful. She avoided the boarding house at mealtimes when she thought Warren Collier would be there, taking her meals early or late, eating alone in her room when she could manage it. She crossed the street when she saw him coming. She kept her eyes down in the manner of a modest widow who did not invite attention. None of it worked, because Warren Collier was a man who noticed things that did not want to be noticed. It had been a Sunday afternoon, 10 days after his arrival, when it happened. She had been sitting at one of the corner tables in the saloon, which doubled as the town's only restaurant at the noon hour, finishing a bowl of stew and trying to look like a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide. He had simply walked in, scanned the room with those October water eyes, and walked directly to her table as though she had sent him an invitation. "Mrs. Ward," he had said, because he had learned her false name from Mrs. Brenner just as she had learned his real one. "Would you mind some company?" And she had looked up at him with every intention of saying, "Yes, actually, I very much mind," and something in her face must have given her away because his expression had shifted just slightly from polite inquiry to something else, something careful and watchful that sent her pulse into a gallop. "I'm not very good company," she had said instead. "That's all right," he had said, and sat down across from her without being invited. They had talked about nothing. The weather, which was warming. The cattle drive that was coming through in another month. Whether the telegraph office would ever get its line properly repaired. And through all of it, she had been exquisitely aware of him watching her, not in the way men in saloons sometimes watched women, not with that ugly calculation, but with something far more unsettling. He watched her the way a man watches a puzzle he is genuinely interested in solving. She had made her excuses after 20 minutes and left, and she had walked back to the boarding house with her shoulders set and her jaw tight, and she had told herself very firmly that she was reading things into nothing. He was a federal marshal passing through. He had no reason to be specifically interested in her. But the next day, he had found a reason to be near the seamstress shop where she worked. And the day after that, he had tipped his hat to her outside the general store with the small, private smile of a man who is not fooling himself about what he is doing. And 3 days after that, he had sat down across from her at the saloon again, and this time the conversation had lasted an hour, and she had laughed exactly once, and hated herself for it afterward, because laughing was something she had given up the right to do. And now, tonight, a full 2 weeks into this slow, careful orbit they had been performing around each other, she had made the mistake of standing up to leave too quickly when she saw the telegram in his hand, the one he had been reading with a face that had gone very still, and he had looked up at exactly the wrong moment and seen something in her face that she had not meant to show him. She had risen from the table. She had been 6 steps from the door, and then his voice. "I would like to know your story." And she had sat back down. The piano player in the corner was noodling through something that might have been a hymn if the piano had been better tuned and the player less interested in the whiskey beside the bench. The saloon was not crowded on a Wednesday evening, just a handful of cowhands at the bar and 2 card games in the back. Nobody was paying attention to the widow woman and the marshal in the corner. "What was in the telegram?" she asked, because she needed to know how much time she had. He looked at her steadily. "It mentioned a woman named Nellie Vaughn," he said, "out of Missouri, wanted for questioning in connection with the death of a man named Gerald Sutter." The name hit her like cold water, and she did not bother hiding the flinch because there was no point. The stone had been turned over. Whatever was underneath was now in the light. "I did not kill him," she said. "I didn't say you did. The telegram implied it." "The telegram said wanted for questioning," Warren said, and his voice was careful and even, the voice of a man who has had a lot of practice not letting people know what he is thinking. "That's a significant distance from accused of murder. And before I do anything at all with any of this, I would like to hear your side of it." She looked at him for a long moment. The saloon creaked around them. Outside, a horse stamped in the street, and somewhere further away a dog was barking with the thin, persistent quality of an animal that has seen something it does not understand. "My side of it is long," she said. "I have nowhere to be tonight," Warren said simply. And something in the quiet certainty of that, the unstated but absolute commitment to sitting there and listening for as long as it took, cracked something open in Nellie Vaughn that had been sealed shut for 2 years and 4 months, and she looked down at the table and thought about where to begin. She began at the beginning. Her name was Nellie Vaughn, she said. She had been born in 1857 in a small town in Missouri called Harlow's Crossing, the youngest of 4 children, the only daughter of a Methodist preacher and his quietly determined wife. She had grown up in a house full of books and principles and not a great deal of money, and she had been the kind of girl who read everything she could find and thought too much and felt too much and occasionally said too much, which had not always made her popular but had always made her honest. When she was 22, she had married a man named Thomas Vaughn, who was a solicitor's clerk in the county town and who had seemed, at the time, like everything sensible and solid and safe. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who had very specific ideas about what a wife should be, and Nellie had discovered, in the 18 months of their marriage before the typhoid fever took him, that she did not fit those ideas very well. She had grieved Thomas genuinely, if not as deeply as the town expected, and she had found herself at 24 a widow with a small inheritance, a rented house, and a profound uncertainty about what came next. What came next was Gerald Sutter. Here she paused, and she looked at the table, and Warren Collier did not say anything, just waited with that oceanic patience of his, and she gathered herself and continued. Gerald Sutter was a businessman from St. Louis, who had come to Harlow's Crossing in the fall of 1880 to look at purchasing some of the farmland on the county's eastern edge. He was 42 years old to her 24, handsome in a polished, expensive way, and possessed of a charm that worked on people the way a key works on a lock, smoothly and with complete certainty. He had courted Nellie for 3 months with flowers and dinners, and the kind of attentive conversation that made a woman feel as though she were the most interesting person in the world. She had not been in love with him. She had told herself that was all right, that affection and compatibility and security were enough, that love was a luxury she had perhaps missed her chance at. She had agreed to marry him and moved to St. Louis in the winter of 1880. The key in the lock, she discovered, worked differently from the inside. Within 6 months, she had understood that Gerald Sutter's businesses were not entirely what they appeared to be. He dealt in legitimate trade on the surface, importing goods from the East Coast for distribution in the Missouri and Kansas markets, but underneath, that legitimate surface ran a hidden current of something much darker. He had connections to men who moved stolen goods across state lines. He paid officials to look away from shipments that did not bear examination. He was not a violent man himself, Nellie said carefully, but he had relationships with men who were, and he had never once hesitated to use those relationships when he felt threatened. "How did you find this out?" Warren asked. His voice was neutral. He was not judging yet. He was just listening, which was something so unusual in her experience that she kept expecting it to stop. She had found it out, she said, the way women find out most things in marriages where information is considered dangerous. By listening when she was not supposed to be listened to, by reading a letter left carelessly on a desk, by paying attention to the texture of silences, the particular kind of silence that falls when a man realizes his wife has just walked into the room and he is not certain how much she heard. By the summer of 1881 she knew enough to be frightened. By the autumn she knew enough to be dangerous. And Gerald had known that she knew, which was the most dangerous position of all. He had not threatened her directly. That was not his way. He had simply begun a quiet, systematic campaign to make her life smaller and smaller, to isolate her from friends, to intercept her letters, to create a world in which she was utterly dependent on him and utterly without allies. It was the kind of cruelty that leaves no marks, the kind that is almost impossible to explain to anyone who has not experienced it, because every individual action can be explained away, and it is only the pattern that tells the truth. She had begun planning her escape in the spring of 1882. It had taken her 4 months to accumulate enough money, a little at a time from the household accounts, tucked into a handkerchief at the back of her wardrobe. 4 months to make contact, through an elaborate and terrifying series of carefully worded letters, with a woman in Kansas City who helped women in Nellie's situation. 4 months to gather the courage to actually do what she had planned. She had left on a Wednesday morning in July of 1882, while Gerald was at his offices. She had taken nothing she could not carry and had left no note, because a note would have told him which direction she had gone. She had taken the rail to Kansas City, changed lines twice to obscure her route, and arrived in a town in Kansas called Millhaven by the following Friday, where the woman from the letters met her and helped her build the beginning of her new identity. She had been in Millhaven for 3 weeks when she heard that Gerald Sutter was dead. He had been found in his St. Louis office with a bullet in him, and the circumstances were murky enough that the authorities had begun casting their net very wide in their search for possible explanations. And because Nellie Vaughn, his wife, had disappeared from the city without a word just weeks before his death, she had been quickly elevated to the top of that list of possible explanations. "But you didn't kill him," Warren said again. "I was in Kansas when he died," Nellie said. "I can prove it, or I could have proven it when it happened, but I panicked. I heard the news and I panicked and I ran. And running is exactly what a guilty person does. And I have been running ever since, which has done absolutely nothing to improve the impression I am giving." Warren was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and she watched his face for the calculation she expected to see, the cold professional measurement of her story against what was useful to him. But what she saw was something different. What she saw, and it frightened her more than the calculation would have, was something that looked very much like belief. "The men who actually killed Sutter," he said slowly. "Do you know who they were?" And this was the part she had never told anyone. This was the hidden core of the whole thing, the secret within the secret, the reason she had stayed running even after she was no longer certain the law was actively pursuing her. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly who killed Gerald Sutter, and they know I know, and that is why I cannot stop running, because it is not the law I am afraid of." The names she gave him were not small names. Reuben Cade was a man who ran a protection and extortion operation across 3 states, who had been Gerald's silent partner in his shadier enterprises for almost a decade. Cade had killed Gerald not over any moral objection to his business practices, but over a disputed share of profits from a particular shipment that had gone wrong. Nellie had overheard the argument, had overheard Cade make his threat, had been in the house on the night the threat was carried out, had hidden in the linen closet with her hand over her mouth while she listened to the sound of it happening below. She had run not because she had killed Gerald. She had run because she had witnessed something, and the man who had done it was a man with a long reach and no patience for loose ends. "Reuben Cade," Warren said, and there was a different quality to his voice now, something that had gone taut and alert. "You know him," Nellie said. "I know of him. He has been on the Federal Marshal Service's list of persons of interest for 4 years. We have never been able to put together enough evidence to bring a case against him." Warren set down his coffee cup very precisely and looked at her across the table with those steady, dark eyes. "Nellie, what exactly did you see?" And she told him. She told him all of it, the argument she had overheard through the study door, the voices, the words spoken, the specific names of 2 other men who had been present. She told him what she had seen when she had looked through the keyhole, and she kept her voice flat and steady, even though her hands were trembling against her thighs, where he could not see them under the table. She told him about the letter she had found the following morning before she ran, the letter in Gerald's desk that she had taken with her, the letter that named Cade and named the operation and named amounts of money that would make a very convincing piece of evidence in front of a federal court. "Where is the letter now?" Warren asked, and his voice was very careful. "In a safe place," she said. "I have been carrying it with me for 2 years. I did not know what to do with it. I was afraid that if I went to the authorities, Cade's people would find out before I was protected, and I would end up the same way Gerald did." "That was not an unreasonable fear," Warren said quietly. "Cade has associates in several law enforcement offices. It is one of the reasons he has been so difficult to pursue." He paused. "But that has changed in the past year. There is a federal prosecutor in Santa Fe who has been building a case carefully with people he has personally vetted, people Cade cannot reach." She looked at him. "And can Cade reach you?" "He has tried," Warren said simply. "He did not succeed." She studied him in the dim saloon light, this man who had appeared in her carefully constructed hiding place and dismantled it with 6 quiet words, and she tried to decide whether she was sitting across from salvation or a more sophisticated version of the trap she had been trying to escape for 2 years. Because that was the thing about dark secrets and hidden motives. They did not always announce themselves. "How do I know," she said carefully, "that you are what you appear to be?" He reached inside his vest and laid his federal marshal's commission on the table between them. Then he laid a letter beside it, bearing the seal of the United States Attorney's Office in Santa Fe and addressed to Deputy Marshal Warren Collier by name. "That is from Prosecutor Hale," Warren said. "If you know the Cade operation the way you say you do, his name will mean something to you." It did. The letter she had taken from Gerald's desk had mentioned Hale, with a note of something that was almost respect, as the one federal official Cade's people had not been able to compromise. The one man who was actually dangerous to them. She looked at the commission and the letter for a long time. Then she looked at Warren Collier. "I have been alone with this for 2 years," she said, "and it came out different from how she intended, not strong and factual but stripped bare of everything except the simple, exhausted truth of it." "I know," he said, and then very quietly, "You don't have to be alone with it anymore." She did not cry. She was very proud of the fact that she did not cry. But something did happen behind her sternum, some long-held tension beginning its slow release, and she had to look away from him for a moment and breathe through it. They talked for another 3 hours that evening. The saloon gradually emptied around them, the card games breaking up, the cowhands drifting out into the night, until it was just the 2 of them and the piano player nodding over his untouched second glass of whiskey. Warren ordered fresh coffee and a plate of whatever the kitchen still had, which turned out to be cold cornbread and sliced beef, and Nellie ate without noticing she was eating because she was too busy talking. She told him things she had not intended to tell him. Not just the facts of Gerald and Cade and the letter and the running, but the things around the facts, the texture of the fear, the particular loneliness of inhabiting a false name in a succession of towns, the way she had almost talked herself into staying in a small Texas settlement called Marta, because there had been a library there, a real library with donated books, and a librarian who had looked at her with uncomplicated welcome. And she had made herself leave anyway because staying was always a risk. She told him about the morning she had woken up in a boarding house in Tucson and not been able to remember, for a full terrifying minute, which name she was currently using. Warren listened to all of it. He did not offer easy reassurances. He did not minimize or redirect. He asked questions that were precise and careful, the questions of a man who was taking her seriously in the deepest and most radical sense of the word, a man who believed her testimony was worth understanding completely. At some point past midnight the piano player left, and then they were entirely alone, and neither of them noticed for a while. "The letter," Warren said eventually, coming back to the practical matter with the focused patience she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "I need to see it. Not to take it from you," he added quickly, and she realized she had tensed, which told her he was watching her more carefully than she had thought. "I would not remove it from your possession without your consent, but I need to see its contents to understand what kind of case it can help build." "And then what?" she asked. "Then I contact Prosecutor Hale," Warren said, carefully, through channels that Cade cannot monitor. "And we arrange for you to be properly deposed, which means you give your testimony in a formal setting with the full protection of the federal court. The wanted notice gets withdrawn once it's established you were not present for Sutter's death, and Cade gets brought in." "You make it sound straightforward," she said. "It is not straightforward," he said honestly. "It is going to take time and it is going to require you to trust people, which I understand is not something that comes easily to you right now, but it is possible. And it is the only path I can see that actually ends this." She thought about the word ends. What a remarkable word it was, the idea that this could end. "If I do this," she said slowly, "and Cade finds out I've spoken to a marshal before he's brought in, he has people everywhere. His operation is across 3 states. "I know," Warren said, "which is why I am suggesting that you stay here, in Redemption Creek, out of Cade's established network of contacts. This town is small enough and remote enough that it is not on his map, and we need to keep it that way while I work through Hale to build the next steps." She looked at him. "You are suggesting I stay here with you keeping watch over me?" "I am suggesting that you stay here," he said carefully, "with me in the adjacent room at Mrs. Brenner's where I am already lodged and where I can be of help if anything goes wrong. I am not suggesting you require someone to keep watch over you. You have clearly managed your own safety very effectively for 2 years. I am suggesting you allow me to be useful." The distinction he drew was not accidental, and she appreciated it more than she knew how to say. She got the letter the next morning. It was sewn into the lining of her carpet bag, in a pocket she had created specifically for it, and she had to use the small pair of sewing scissors she always kept handy to access it. She brought it to Warren at the boarding house kitchen table, after Mrs. Brenner had gone out to see about the week's supply order, and she spread it open between them on the oilcloth. He read it twice without speaking. His face did not change very much, but something behind his eyes went very still and focused, like a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it. "This is extraordinarily specific," he said at last. "Gerald was extraordinarily meticulous," Nellie said. "Whatever else he was. This names dates, amounts, and locations for 6 separate operations, and it names associates I have never been able to connect to Cade before." He looked up at her. "Nellie, this is not just a piece of evidence. This is the backbone of an entire federal prosecution. Hale has been trying to build this case for 4 years without something like this. So it's useful," she said flatly. "It is more than useful. It is essential." He folded the letter carefully. "And it is also why Cade has been looking for you. He knows this document exists. I am almost certain he does. Gerald mentioned it in their argument that night. He threatened to use it against Cade if Cade moved against him. Cade moved against him anyway, and then the letter was gone, and Cade would have known immediately what that meant." Warren nodded slowly. "Then we have a timeline problem. If Cade's network has been looking for you for 2 years without finding you, The question is how long that continues to be the case. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Anyone in town who seemed out of place? She thought about it. There had been a man who came through on the stage 4 days ago who had asked Mrs. Brenner apparently casual questions about her other boarders. She had not thought much of it at the time because strangers came through and people made conversation, but she mentioned it now. Warren's expression did not alarm her, but it sharpened. What did he look like? He asked. She described him. Medium height, sandy-colored hair, a scar along the left jaw. A quality of watchful stillness that she had noticed and then consciously dismissed because she had been trying to stop seeing threats everywhere. Warren was quiet for a moment. That description matches a man named Birch who has worked for Cade before. He is a finder. Cade sends him out when he wants someone located. He looked at her steadily. That does change our timeline. If Birch came through, it means Cade's network is getting warmer. We may not have as much time to work gradually as I had hoped. How much time? Nellie asked, and she was proud of how level her voice was. I don't know. It depends on whether Birch found anything useful in his questions, and whether Redemption Creek has any significance to him or whether he is making a sweep of small towns in the territory. Warren leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the expression of a man making calculations. I am going to send a wire to Santa Fe today, carefully worded, through a code that Hale and I use for sensitive communications. And in the meantime, I think it would be wise if you were not seen too prominently in town. You mean hide, she said. I mean be cautious, he said, and the small distinction in his tone again, the careful effort not to make her feel like cargo to be managed, was something she noticed. Over the following 10 days, an unusual thing happened alongside all the very usual urgency and danger. The unusual thing was that Nellie Vaughn began to know Warren Collier, and knowing him was not at all what she had expected. She had expected efficiency. She had expected the professional competence of a man who was good at his job and found her primarily useful as a witness. What she found, in the enforced proximity of a small boarding house and a small town while they waited for Hale's response and watched the road for signs of Cade's people, was a man of surprising depth and somewhat inconvenient kindness. He had grown up in Virginia. He told her one evening when they were sitting on the boarding house porch watching the sun go down behind the mesa. His father had been a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher. He had 2 sisters, both married, one in Richmond and one in Tennessee. He had come west after the war, which had taken his older brother and left Warren at 17 trying to understand what a country was for, and the West had given him a sense of purpose when he could not find one looking east. He had been a deputy marshal for 6 years. Before that, a brief and not entirely successful attempt at cattle ranching outside Albuquerque. And before that, a longer and more satisfying stint working for the railroad survey crews, mapping the territory's less accessible corners. He liked maps, he said, with the small, quiet pleasure of a man mentioning something he has not told many people. Maps, she said. They tell you exactly where you are, he said. Which seems obvious, but when you spend enough time in country where landmarks change and the ground is not what you expect, you develop an appreciation for knowing where you are. She thought about the past 2 years of her life, the succession of towns and false names and deliberately unmapped territory, and she said, I have not had a map for quite some time. He looked at her, and she felt the weight of what she had actually meant arrive in his expression a moment after she had said it. No, he said. I don't imagine you have. His response to the wire from Santa Fe came on the 11th day, and it arrived in the careful code he had described, a series of innocuous-seeming commercial inquiries that, when decoded, contained a message from Prosecutor Hale that made Warren's jaw tighten in a way she was learning to read. Hale confirms he wants the deposition, he told her. He is arranging transport and a secure location. He expects he can have everything in place within 3 weeks. He folded the paper. He also confirms that Cade's people have been making inquiries in the territory. Birch is not the only one looking. Hale has intelligence suggesting Cade has sent 2 more men into New Mexico territory in the past month. 3 more men looking for her, which meant 3 weeks was a very long time. There is another option, Warren said, and his voice had taken on a careful quality that told her he had been sitting with this for a while before saying it. Hale can have a pair of federal deputies here within a week if we ask. They would escort you to Santa Fe directly, under proper protection. The deposition could happen sooner, but that would require 2 federal deputies riding into Redemption Creek, she said, which would be noticeable, and if Cade's people are watching the roads, yes, he said. It creates a risk of its own, she thought about it. What is the other option? He met her eyes. We go to Santa Fe ourselves, now, taking a route that is not the stage road that moves through country. Cade's people are unlikely to be watching. I know this territory well. I have ridden most of it. The 2 of us, she said. Yes, she considered this. The practical dangers of it, the practicalities of a journey across difficult country, and the other thing, the less practical thing, which was that she had not allowed herself to be truly alone with another person's care and company for 2 years, and that 10 days of Warren Collier's particular quality of attention had already done significant damage to the walls she had built, and that 3 or 4 days of just the 2 of them, riding across the New Mexico territory in the early summer of 1883, was either the best or the worst idea she had ever agreed to. She agreed to it. They left before dawn on a Friday, with Mrs. Brenner sworn to tell anyone who asked that Mrs. Ward had gone to visit a cousin in Albuquerque, and that Mr. Collier had business in the same direction. Mrs. Brenner, who was a practical woman and had clearly noticed more than she said about the situation in her boarding house over the past week, had simply nodded and then pressed a wrapped package of food on Nellie with the brisk efficiency of a woman who expressed emotion through provisions. Warren had 2 horses, the tall bay he had arrived on, and a roan mare he had acquired locally for exactly this contingency. Nellie could ride adequately enough to manage a gentle-tempered horse in reasonable country, and the roan was exactly that. He had packed carefully, supplies for 4 days, bedrolls, a rifle in the saddle scabbard and the revolver he always wore at his hip, a medical kit and rope. The first day they rode mostly in silence, which was not uncomfortable. She had expected it might be, that the silence would be heavy with everything unresolved between them, but it was not that kind of silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have already said a great deal and are comfortable letting the space between the words breathe. The country was extraordinary. She had never been through this particular stretch of the territory, and the landscape shifted through the day in ways that surprised her, from the flat scrub of the lower terrain through increasingly dramatic formations of red rock, buttes and mesas, catching the morning light at angles that turned them into something that had no business existing in any practical world. She found herself looking around as though she had never really looked before, as though 2 years of keeping her eyes down and her head ducked had stripped something out of her capacity for seeing, and it was coming back now with an almost painful vividness. "You are looking at the country," Warren observed at one point, not as a criticism but as a simple noting of fact, with a slight warmth in his voice. "I had forgotten it was here," she said. "It is always here," he said. "The trick is remembering to look." They camped the first night in the shelter of a rock formation that Warren knew, a natural alcove that blocked the wind and provided cover, with a seep of water nearby where the horses could drink. He built a small fire, contained and low-flamed, less for warmth, as the night was mild, than for the coffee, and she found herself sitting across from it and feeling, in the way of something almost forgotten, like herself. Not a leaner Ward, the careful fiction. Not Nellie Vaughn the fugitive, the running woman, the woman with a dark past and a letter sewn into her bag and 2 years of accumulated fear. Just herself, Nellie, sitting by a fire in the New Mexico territory, with the stars overhead in numbers that the East had never managed to assemble, and a man across the fire who was looking at her the way she was learning he looked at everything, as though she were genuinely worth understanding. "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes," he said. "When you read the telegram, the one with my name in it, did you think I had done it, killed Gerald?" He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not answer immediately, that he was actually thinking about it rather than offering the comfortable thing. "No," he said at last. "I don't know exactly why not. The telegram was framed in a way that implied suspicion, but something about the way you had been in town, the way you carried yourself, the particular kind of watchfulness you had. It was the watchfulness of someone who is afraid, not someone who is guilty. Guilt has a different texture." "You can see that?" she asked. "After 6 years mostly," he said. "Not always. I have been wrong before." He paused. "But not this time." She looked at him across the fire. "You took an enormous risk, talking to me the way you did in the saloon instead of simply arresting you on the basis of a wanted notice." "Yes, a wanted notice for questioning," he said, "not a warrant. And I have spent enough time in this work to know that the difference matters. People who are wanted for questioning are very often people who saw something they were not supposed to see, or who were in the wrong place at a carefully chosen wrong time." He looked at the fire. "I have also spent enough time in this work to know what it costs when someone in my position does not listen." She thought there was something personal in that, some specific memory behind the words, but she did not ask. There would be time for that, or there would not. Either way, this particular moment felt complete as it was. They talked for another hour before sleep. About Missouri, which he had passed through once on his way west and remembered as green and slightly overwhelming after the open territory. About books, which led to a conversation that surprised her with how much ground it covered, how many of the same things they had read, how differently they had read them. He had strong opinions about Cooper's novels, which she found charming and argued against, and she had opinions about the law, which he listened to with careful attention, and then respectfully and specifically engaged with rather than dismissing, which was the most attractive thing she had yet seen him do. The second day brought rain in the afternoon, a hard, brief summer storm that came off the mountains with very little warning and soaked them before they could find adequate shelter, and they rode through it laughing, which surprised her so much she nearly lost the reins, because she had not expected to laugh, and the sound of it coming out of her own mouth was strange and good and a little frightening. Warren looked over at her when she laughed, and his expression was something she could not fully read, some layering of warmth and relief and something else, something she was not ready to name yet, but recognized nonetheless as significant. They sheltered under a rocky overhang when the lightning grew too close to ignore, standing close because the overhang was not large. Their horses pressed together in the reluctant comradeship of animals seeking warmth, and she was very aware of the nearness of him, the solid, reliable presence of a person who had chosen, without obligation or calculation, to be here. "Warren," she said, because she had been thinking about something and the rain made it easier to say things. "Why did you stay in Redemption Creek? You said you were passing through, but you have been there for weeks." He was quiet for a moment. "I was passing through," he said, "and then I wasn't." "Because of the investigation." "Partly," he said. She looked at him. "What is the other part?" He met her eyes, and in the gray rain light under the overhang he looked very serious, the way a man looks when he is being precise about something important. "You know what the other part is," he said. She did know. She had known for several days, and knowing it had been doing complicated things to her carefully maintained internal order. To the conviction she had arrived in Redemption Creek with that she was done with trusting people. That trust was a trap she had already sprung once and could not afford to spring again. "I am not an easy person to know," she said. "I have a dark past and a complicated present and a future that is currently entirely uncertain." "I am aware of all of that," he said. "I am not sure I remember how to let someone in." "I'm not asking you to do it all at once," he said. "I am asking you to allow the possibility." She looked out at the rain. The territory in the rain was a different kind of beautiful, the colors deepening, the stone going dark red and the sage going silver, and the smell of it was the smell of everything being washed, which seemed, under the circumstances, appropriate. "All right," she said. It was a small word for what it meant. But he understood it, because he was paying the kind of attention that makes small words legible. The third day they crossed into more settled country, following a trail Warren knew that ran parallel to but well south of the main road, and they began to see other travelers occasionally. A freighter's wagon, a pair of cowboys moving a small remuda north, a family in a covered wagon who were clearly and determinedly headed somewhere with everything they owned. Nellie watched the family pass and felt a different kind of ache from the one she had been carrying for 2 years, a forward-looking ache rather than a backward one, which was something she had not expected to feel. That night they stayed in a small way station, a single building run by a taciturn man named Hollies who rented floor space and sold dubious coffee and good beans, and she and Warren sat across from each other at the rough table after Hollies had gone to his back room, and talked in quiet voices until the lantern burned low. He told her about the brother he had lost in the war. His name had been Daniel, and he had been 22 when he died at Cold Harbor, and Warren had been 16 at the time and had not understood yet what the word permanent truly meant. He had spent several years after the war, he said, in a kind of directionless anger that had not made him a particularly pleasant person to be around, and it had been a specific mentor, an older marshal in Albuquerque named Bridges, who had taken him on as a deputy and shown him by example that purposeful work done honestly was a reasonable answer to the question of what to do with a life that felt unmoored. "Is that what this is for you?" she asked. "The work?" "It was," he said. For a long time it was sufficient. He looked at the lantern flame. "It is still meaningful, but I am not sure sufficient is still the right word." She understood what he meant, and understanding it meant acknowledging that something had shifted in herself as well, that the careful self-sufficiency she had cultivated through 2 years of survival, the absolute rejection of dependence, was not the same thing as not wanting connection. It was just the posture of someone who had been hurt and was protecting themselves. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers for a moment, just briefly, just long enough to say what words were too complicated for, and then drew her hand back. He did not say anything. He just looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and something in them was very warm. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe on the evening of the 4th day, approaching the city in the golden light of late afternoon, the old adobe buildings warm and geometric against the deepening sky, the smell of cook fires and horses, and the dry high-altitude air mixing into something that was particular to this city, and no other place she had been. Warren had sent a wire ahead from the way station. Prosecutor Hale's office had a man waiting at the edge of town, a young deputy named Esposito who knew them by description, and who led them, through several turns of the old city streets, to a house on a side street that was not the federal courthouse, but that bore, inside the door, the unmistakable atmosphere of official proceedings being taken seriously. Prosecutor Hale was a thin man in his 50s, with a Virginia accent he had not entirely lost, and the eyes of someone who had been looking at complicated things for a very long time without blinking. He shook Nellie's hand as though she were a colleague rather than a witness, and that small thing, the handshake rather than the deferential nod, told her something useful about him. He looked at the letter she had carried for 2 years in the lining of her bag, and his expression went through several things very quickly before settling into the controlled professional focus she expected. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said carefully, setting the letter down. "I want to begin by telling you that the federal warrant request for questioning in connection with Gerald Sutter's death is being withdrawn effective immediately. I am satisfied, based on the travel records and the corroborating testimony of several witnesses in Millhaven, Kansas, that you were not present in St. Louis when Sutter died. That question is closed." Something in her chest unknotted itself that she had not realized was still knotted. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was almost completely steady. "What I would like to discuss with you now," Hale continued, "is your testimony regarding what you witnessed in the Sutter house on the night of the 15th of June, 1882, and the contents of this document and what you are willing to do about it." She told him everything formally, with Warren sitting beside her in a chair that he had drawn close without ceremony, close enough that she was aware of his presence as a steady warmth on her left side throughout the hour and a half it took. She told Hale what she had seen and heard through the keyhole of Gerald's study. She described the argument, the voices, the specific words spoken. She told him about the two other men who had been present as witnesses, whose names she gave him, and Hale wrote them down with the careful script of a man who knows that names have weight. At the end of it, Hale sat back in his chair and looked at his notes. "This is sufficient," he said quietly. "Bind with what we already have, and with this document this is more than sufficient." He looked at her directly. "I want you to understand what the next steps will involve. We will need you available for formal deposition, and potentially for testimony in federal court if this goes to trial, which I believe it will. This means your security is a matter of federal interest. You will be provided with accommodation and protection here in Santa Fe for as long as the process requires." "How long?" she asked. "These things move slowly," he said honestly. "The arrest and arraignment could happen within weeks if things go well. The trial itself, likely several months from now." "I will not pretend it is quick." She thought about this. Several months in Santa Fe. She had been moving for 2 years, and the idea of actually stopping in one place with something like legitimacy, was almost too much to process. "One more thing," Hale said. He looked at Warren. "I am formally requesting that Deputy Marshal Collier remain assigned to the security detail for Mrs. Vaughn during this process." His familiarity with the case and with Cade's operation makes him the most logical choice. He paused, and something in his careful face suggested that he was also observant enough to understand that logic was not the only reason for this particular assignment. "If Deputy Marshal Collier is agreeable," Warren glanced at Nellie. "I am agreeable," he said. She looked at the table because looking at him directly in that moment was too much. The arrest of Reuben Cade took 6 weeks. It was not the dramatic confrontation that stories made of such things. It was a carefully coordinated operation involving federal deputies in 3 states moving simultaneously on a Monday morning. Cade himself apprehended at his office in St. Louis with the methodical efficiency of men who had waited a long time for this, and were not going to allow any loose ends. 2 of his associates were taken at the same time. Birch the Finder was picked up in Albuquerque by a deputy who had been watching him for days. Nellie heard about it from Warren, who came to the door of the house Hale had arranged for her with his hat in his hands and told her in a quiet, factual voice, and she sat down on the nearest chair and was silent for a full minute before she trusted her voice. "It's over," she said. "Not a question." "The immediate danger is over," he said. "The trial is still ahead and your testimony, but yes. The part where you have to look over your shoulder every time you walk down a street, that part is over." She put her face in her hands. Not weeping, just needing a moment of darkness, a moment to let the enormity of it arrive without being watched. He did not speak or move, just waited, which was exactly right. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen before, the careful professional composure temporarily set aside, and what was underneath it was something that made her breath go uneven. "Warren," she said. "Nellie," he said. They looked at each other across the room in the house on the Santa Fe side street, with the New Mexico summer outside the window and the sound of the city going about its ordinary life. And the thing that had been building between them for 6 weeks of proximity and trust and conversation, and one rainstorm and one long evening at a way station table, and 6 words spoken softly in a saloon arrived, fully formed and impossible to ignore. He crossed the room and she stood up and met him halfway, which was the thing she was most proud of, that she had not waited to be reached, that she had gone halfway. And then his arms were around her and her face was against his shoulder, and he held her with the same care he brought to everything, thorough and steady, and absolutely without reservation. She let herself be held for a long time. It was the first time in 2.5 years that she had allowed this, another person's warmth and solidity, and it was extraordinary what it did to the architecture of exhaustion she had been maintaining. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, against his shoulder. "Tell me," he said. "I was not planning to trust anyone again," she said. "I had been quite firm with myself about it." "How is that working out?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in it. "Poorly," she said, "thoroughly and completely poorly." "I am very glad to hear it," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him, and she put her hand against the side of his face, which was something she had thought about doing for several weeks, and he turned his face slightly into her palm with the simple, undefended gesture of a man who is not afraid of being known. She kissed him. He kissed her back with the same quality that characterized everything he did, completely present, not rushed, as though this exact moment deserved the full weight of his attention, which she was learning was his way of saying that she deserved it. The months that followed were the most peculiar of her life, peculiar in the sense of being entirely new in kind, unlike anything she had experienced before. The formal deposition happened in August. 3 hours of careful testimony before a federal notary, with Hale present and Warren waiting outside the door. She came out of it hollow with exhaustion, and Warren handed her a glass of water and then walked with her through the Santa Fe streets for an hour, saying nothing particularly, just being present alongside her while she came back to herself. The trial was set for November. In the months between, they built something. That was the only word she had for it. Building. The slow, careful construction of a shared life in a city that was neither of their histories but was becoming, by virtue of their both being in it, something that felt like a future. She found work in Santa Fe doing what she was good at, sewing and alterations, working from a small shop off the main plaza that was owned by an older woman named Senora Delgado who had impeccable taste and absolutely no patience for sloppiness, and who had looked at Nellie's work and hired her on the spot. The work was honest and skilled, and she was good at it, and coming home in the evenings to the house where she was no longer pretending to be anyone other than herself was something she had to practice, because she kept catching herself slipping into the careful posture of a leaner ward, the widow, the fiction, and then consciously setting it down. Warren was assigned to Santa Fe officially during the trial period, which meant he was near. He came for supper 3 evenings a week, and on Sundays they walked in the hills outside the city where the late summer light did extraordinary things to the rock, and he pointed out things in the landscape with the informed pleasure of a man who has spent years learning to read terrain. And she pointed out things about the sky and the plants that he had never thought to look at, and they were, she realized one October afternoon, genuinely happy. Not desperately happy, not the feverish happiness of people who have been starved of it, but the solid, reliable kind that does not require noise or urgency to sustain itself. He asked her to marry him in October, 2 weeks before the trial, on a Sunday afternoon in the hills with the aspens already yellow, and the air carrying the first edge of the coming winter. He did not go down on one knee, which she appreciated, because it would not have suited either of them. He stopped walking and turned to face her and said, simply and directly in the manner she had come to love, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, that he was entirely clear on this, and that he was asking her because he wanted her choice to be made freely, not because of gratitude or circumstance or anything other than her own wanting. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had sat across from her in a saloon in a forgotten town in New Mexico territory, and spoken 6 quiet words that had changed everything. And she thought about the woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek with a carpet bag, and a false name, and 2 years of fear built into the set of her shoulders. And she thought about what it meant that that woman was standing here now in October sunshine being asked by an honest man if she wanted a future. Yes, she said, freely and entirely and without reservation, yes. He smiled, which was something he did not do constantly, which was exactly why it mattered when he did, and it was the smile of a man whose happiness is very deep and has nowhere particular to rush. The trial of Reuben Cade opened on the 12th of November, 1883, in the federal courthouse in Santa Fe. It lasted 8 days. Nellie testified on the 4th day, and she sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and spoke clearly and completely about everything she had seen and heard on the night of the 15th of June, 1882, in Gerald Sutter's study in St. Louis. She did not embellish, and she did not minimize, and she did not look away from the defense counsel's attempt to rattle her, which was considerable but ultimately unsuccessful because she had nothing to hide and nothing to protect, and the truth, as she had always known, was its own kind of armor. Warren was in the gallery throughout her testimony, not in a way anyone watching would have found noteworthy, just a man sitting in the public seats. But she knew he was there, and knowing it made no difference to the quality of her testimony, which she would have given with equal clarity alone, but it made a difference to her. The way knowing that solid ground exists beneath your feet makes a difference even when you are not thinking about it. Cade was convicted on the 19th of November on multiple charges including murder, conspiracy, and interstate fraud. 2 of his associates received lesser sentences as part of their cooperation agreements. A third was acquitted for lack of direct evidence, which was the one imperfect thread, but Hale was satisfied with the outcome, and Nellie, watching the verdict read, felt something settle in her that had not been still in 2.5 years. She walked out of the courthouse into the November air and stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing. Warren came to stand beside her and did not say anything, which was correct, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. "What do we do now?" she asked, not anxiously, just curious, because for the first time in a very long time the question was actually open. "Whatever we want," he said, "within reason." She laughed, and it was still surprising every time, the ease of it. They were married in December of 1883, in a civil ceremony at the Santa Fe courthouse performed by a federal judge who knew Warren and approved of him in the economical way that taciturn men of principle approve of each other. Senora Delgado came as a witness, and Hale came as the other, and afterward they had supper at the best restaurant in the city, and Warren ordered champagne, which he claimed to dislike, but drank 2 glasses of anyway with the dignified expressions of a man maintaining a position against increasing evidence. They talked about where to go. Warren's assignment in Santa Fe was flexible. Hale had offered him a permanent position with the federal prosecutor's office as an investigative deputy, which would allow him to be based in the territory rather than constantly traveling. Nellie had been offered a partnership arrangement by Senora Delgado, which was not a small thing, and which she had not yet given an answer to. They went back to Redemption Creek for 2 weeks in the spring of 1884, partly because Warren wanted to settle a remaining piece of administrative business with the territory, and partly because Nellie wanted to see Mrs. Brenner and tell her the truth. Mrs. Brenner listened to the abbreviated version of it with her arms folded, and a very German expression of restrained but genuine feeling on her face. And at the end she said that she had known there was something, and that she was glad it had come out right. And then she pressed an enormous package of food on them both and refused payment for anything. Redemption Creek was as it had always been, slightly worn at the edges and entirely itself, and Nellie walked down its main street on a Tuesday afternoon in March and felt a complicated affection for it that surprised her. This was where the story had turned. This was where she had sat back down instead of walking out the door, and the whole of what her life was now had pivoted on that moment. They went back to Santa Fe, and she accepted Senora Delgado's offer, and Warren accepted Hale's position. And they found a house on a quieter street, larger than the one she had been staying in, with a garden that needed attention and windows that caught the morning light at a favorable angle. The garden was where she was when she understood, on a morning in early May, that things were about to change again. She sat with this knowledge for a few days, turning it over the way you turn a stone in the light to see its different surfaces. And then she told Warren on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the small porch after supper, watching the sky go through its extravagant closing sequence of colors. He went very still in the particular way he had when something important was arriving, and then he turned to look at her, and his face did something she had never quite seen it do before, something that went far past the controlled steadiness he wore by habit and into a territory that was entirely unguarded. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Quite certain," she said. He reached for her hand and held it, and they sat together watching the Santa Fe sky go dark over the mesa, and she felt the future settling around them like something that had always been meant to arrive. Their son was born in December of 1884, a healthy, loud, emphatic arrival who made his feelings about the world abundantly clear from the first moment, and who received the name Daniel, after the brother Warren had lost, which Warren had suggested one evening with the casual steadiness of a man mentioning something he had thought about for a long time and was finally ready to say aloud. She had said yes immediately, without needing to think, because she understood exactly what it meant. Daniel Collier was a child of particular enthusiasm and extremely strong opinions, which he had clearly inherited from both parents. He was walking boldly by 10 months and talking in full sentences by 18, which seemed early to Nellie but which Senora Delgado, who had 5 grandchildren and considered herself the final authority on child development, said was simply the natural result of having a mother who talked to him constantly and a father who read to him every evening without fail. Warren was the kind of father she had hoped he would be, thorough and patient and genuinely interested, treating the small person with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. She had watched him with Daniel in those early months with a feeling she could not have named before but could name now. It was the feeling of having chosen correctly. The shop on the plaza did well. Senora Delgado had an eye for the city's expanding ambitions, and as Santa Fe grew and the arrival of the railroad in the territory brought new commerce and new residents with specific ideas about fashion and fabric, there was real business to be done. Nellie had a gift for the work that she had never fully acknowledged in the years she had spent performing careful invisibility, and being able to use it without apology, without hiding, was a pleasure that refreshed itself daily. Warren's work for Hale's office had expanded in scope. The successful prosecution of Cade had given the federal operation both credibility and momentum, and there were other operations to pursue in the territory with the same methodical patience. He was not gone as much as he had been as a traveling deputy, which suited both of them, though he was occasionally required to travel for specific investigations, and she had learned to manage this with more equanimity than she would have expected. She was not someone who required constant proximity. She trusted him. That was the thing that made the distance bearable, the simple, solid fact of trusting him. She had written to her family in Missouri in the spring of 1884, before Daniel was born. It had been the hardest letter she had ever composed, harder than the testimony in the Cade trial, because her family did not know the full story of what had happened, and she had to decide how much truth to offer and in what order. She had written 3 drafts and sent the 4th, which told them she was alive and well and safe and married, and that she would explain everything when she could, and that she hoped they might be willing to begin again. Her mother had written back within 3 weeks, a letter so full of relief and love, and carefully contained recrimination about the years of silence that it made Nellie laugh and cry simultaneously, which was something she had not known she could do until that particular letter. Her mother and one of her brothers came to Santa Fe in the summer of 1885, making the rail journey with the nervous determination of people doing something they consider important enough to be slightly terrifying. And the reunion on the Santa Fe station platform was the kind of scene that is too large to be remembered clearly in its entirety, only in fragments: her mother's arms, her brother's awkward and genuine embrace. The way Warren stood back with Daniel on his hip and gave them the space of it. She had introduced him to her mother afterward, and her mother had looked at Warren Collier with the assessment of a woman who had been worrying about her youngest child for several years, and then had nodded with a brevity that contained a great deal of complicated approval. The summer of 1885 was one of the good ones. Her family was in the city for 3 weeks, and during those weeks, Santa Fe was a place of meals and conversations, and walks through the old streets with her brother, who had never been west and who kept stopping to look at things with the gratified astonishment of a man encountering landscapes he had previously only read about. Warren and her brother Francis found, to the surprise of both of them, that they got along extremely well, which had something to do with their shared interest in maps, and possibly something to do with their mutual willingness to argue good-naturedly about things they cared about, and then let the argument go. After her mother and brother went back to Missouri, she found that the visit had closed some remaining piece of the old wound. She had not fully realized that carrying her family's ignorance of her life had been another weight, less acute than the fear and the running but real in its way, and setting it down left her lighter. She found out in the autumn of 1885 that a second child was on the way, and told Warren in the garden on a Saturday morning while he was in the moderately successful process of trying to grow tomatoes in the high desert climate, which was an enterprise that Senora Delgado had told him 3 times would not work, and which he persisted in with the cheerful stubbornness of a man who considers failure a more interesting outcome than not trying. He stood up from the tomato bed and looked at her and then looked at the tomatoes and then back at her, and she started laughing at his expression, which was the expression of a man trying to prioritize 2 significant pieces of information simultaneously. "The tomatoes can wait," she said. "The tomatoes," he agreed seriously, "can absolutely wait." Their daughter arrived in April of 1886, and she was named Clara after Warren's mother, which Nellie had suggested, and which had done something to Warren's face when she suggested it that told her she had chosen correctly. Clara had Warren's eyes, the dark river-water October color, and Nellie's determined mouth, and she made her opinions known from an early age with a clarity that everyone in the household respected. Daniel, who was 16 months older and had been the absolute center of the universe for his entire brief life, regarded Clara for the first week with the deeply considered ambivalence of a person whose situation has been fundamentally altered, and then decided, apparently, that having someone to be in charge of was acceptable, which expressed itself as a proprietorial interest in her well-being that was entirely his own invention, and that everyone found secretly charming. The years settled into themselves with the particular texture of a life that has been hard-won, and is therefore appreciated in its ordinariness. The shop on the plaza continued. Warren continued his work with Hale's office, which expanded as the federal presence in the territory grew with statehood approaching on the horizon, still some years away but visible. Santa Fe changed around them slowly, the way cities change: new buildings, new people, new commerce, while the old adobe and the old mountains remained stubbornly themselves. Nellie had begun, in the quiet evenings after the children were in bed and Warren was working at his desk or reading, to write. Not formally, not with any plan to show anyone, but for herself, the way she had written in diaries as a girl in Missouri before the world had impressed upon her the importance of not leaving a record. She wrote about Harlow's Crossing and about Gerald and about the 2 years of running, and about a saloon in a small town in New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1883, and about 6 words spoken softly that had changed everything. She did not know what it was for yet. Perhaps it was just for the record, the private satisfaction of having set it down honestly, every part of it, the dark and the light and the complicated middle ground. One evening Warren came and sat beside her while she was writing, which he did not usually do, and she looked up and he said, "What are you working on?" "My story," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all of it," she said. He nodded, and there was something in his face that she recognized as the same thing she had seen that night in the saloon in Redemption Creek when he had first asked to hear it. The particular quality of a man who believes that the truth of a person is worth knowing in its entirety, that the dark parts and the frightening parts and the parts that did not resolve neatly were as worth knowing as the rest. "Good," he said simply. She looked at him in the lamplight of their house in Santa Fe. This man she had not expected and could not imagine being without. And she thought about the woman who had walked into a saloon in Redemption Creek trying to be invisible, who had been halfway to the door and had sat back down instead, not knowing that sitting back down was the bravest and best thing she had ever done. She went back to writing. He went back to his book. In the next room, Daniel and Clara were asleep, as they should have been, as they occasionally were not when the moonlight came through a certain window at a certain angle, and prompted what Daniel called important conversations and what Clara called stories, which was a habit she had absolutely from her mother. The house breathed around them in the quiet way of houses that have been lived in and are known. Outside, the Santa Fe night was clear and cold, the stars in their extravagant western numbers, the mountains invisible in the darkness but present in the way that things too large for ordinary seeing are present, by implication, by the shape of the absence they make in the sky. This was the life. Not the life she had planned, which was just as well, since planning had gotten her Thomas Vaughn and Gerald Sutter and 2 years of living under a false name, but the life that had happened when she had been honest about who she was and brave enough to stop running. The life that had begun with 6 quiet words and a choice made with shaking hands to sit back down and speak the truth. She wrote for another hour and then set down her pen and looked at what she had written, at the imperfect, specific, irreplaceable record of a life that had come through everything it had come through and arrived here, in this house, in this light, with these people. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Warren looked up from his book as she set the pen down, and their eyes met across the room with the particular quality of understanding that builds between 2 people over years of choosing each other, the shorthand that does not need words because the words have already been said and the meaning lives now in the space between them. "Come to bed," he said. She closed the notebook. "Yes," she said. She put out the lamp and took his hand, and they went through the quiet house together, past the room where their children slept with the complete abandonment of children who have never had reason to be afraid of sleeping. And she was struck, as she sometimes was and expected to keep being struck for the rest of her life, by the profound, ordinary, miraculous fact of it. Nellie Vaughn had once sat in a saloon in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, with her hand on the edge of the table and her legs failing her, and she had been asked to stay and be known. And she had stayed, and she had been known. And from that one moment of staying, the whole improbable, beautiful structure of her life had grown. She had been halfway to the door. She sat back down, and everything that mattered was the result.